BOUTTE could be one move away from finally fixing the WR2 problem next to McLaurin, but according to Albert Breer, the asking price on this trade just jumped, and there's one thing Adam Peters still refuses to do to get it done. Trey Amos is walking into training camp fully healthy and already locked in as the CB1 on the depth chart, but that raises a bigger question, whether the rest of Durante Jones's secondary is ready to hold up once real football starts. And Adam Peters spent his final pick of the draft on a quarterback who won't even take a snap this season, a move half the DMV graded a C- without catching the real reason behind it, one that has everything to do with life after Marcus Mariota. Stick around because these three stories connect more than they let on. Raise hail. Let's start with the story keeping me up at night this week, because it's the classic situation where every fan wants something to happen that the front office so far hasn't lifted a finger to make happen. BOUTTE, wide receiver for the Patriots, has been stuck in trade rumors to Washington for weeks, and I completely get why the fan base got so hyped. I did too, I'll admit it. But we need to break this down with a clear head, because there are layers here most reaction videos aren't touching. First, the real context of why BOUTTE is on the market. New England completely overhauled their receiver room this offseason. They signed Romeo Doubs in free agency and traded for A.J. Brown out of Philadelphia, who's coming off a Super Bowl appearance. With Brown and Doubs walking in, BOUTTE went from being an important piece in Drake May's offense to buried on the depth chart. BOUTTE's 2025 numbers aren't empty stats either. 33 catches, 551 yards, 6 touchdowns in 14 games, averaging 16.7 yards per catch, a number that screams vertical threat. That's exactly the profile Washington needs next to McLaurin, because let's be honest, after McLaurin, this receiver room still scares me. Now, the Jaden Daniels connection. BOUTTE and Daniels were teammates at LSU back in 2022. The season Daniels started 14 games, and BOUTTE hauled in real production from him. That college chemistry is a legitimate argument, not a cute story to farm clicks. When a quarterback already knows a receiver's timing and tendencies from college, the NFL adjustment period shrinks dramatically. Analysts at Bleacher Report and Sporting News have pointed this out, and they're not saying it because it sounds nice. They're saying it because in modern football, timing chemistry is worth just as much as raw talent. But here's the problem, and it's the one nobody's solving well in their videos: the price. Bleacher Report's Mo Moughton proposed Washington send a 2027 fifth-round pick for BOUTTE. Sounds reasonable, right? The problem is, according to Albert Breer, a top-tier insider, the numbers being reported don't line up. During draft weekend, Breer said a fifth-round pick would get it done, but more recent reports this month have New England asking for something closer to a third-rounder. That means either BOUTTE's price went up or these sources are contradicting each other, and honestly, neither option works in Washington's favor. That's where this conversation gets uncomfortable. Adam Peters, and I say this knowing exactly how he's operated this offseason, has completely stayed away from making trades for veterans. The 2027 draft class is shaping up to be exceptional, and Peters has made it crystal clear with every move, or really every non-move, that he'd rather stack draft capital than spend picks on insurance policies for the receiver room. In fact, according to a source close to the situation cited by Rigo's Rag, Washington hasn't even formally expressed interest in BOUTTE yet. That, to me, is the single most important piece of information in this whole story, and almost nobody is highlighting it. And there's a second layer that complicates this even further. BOUTTE himself told Dan Roche of WBZ that he wants to stay in New England for the rest of his career. His exact words were that Boston is his new home. So we've got a player saying he doesn't want to leave, a team saying it wants to do right by him by finding a new home, and a potential buyer, us, the Commanders, who hasn't even seriously picked up the phone. That's not an advanced negotiation. That's at best a summer rumor feeding itself because it makes sense on paper. My personal take on this, and I could be wrong, is that this trade doesn't happen in July or August. It might not even happen at the October trade deadline, unless two very specific conditions line up. First condition, Treylon Burks or Antonio Williams struggle in camp and the receiver room looks so thin that Peters decides paying the higher price for BOUTTE is worth breaking his own offseason philosophy. Second condition, New England drops its third round ask down towards something closer to a 5th or 6th because Boutte's market cools off more than they expected. If neither of those happens, this is going to be one of those rumors that lives on Twitter and never actually materializes. And honestly, watching how Peters has handled every decision this year with almost surgical discipline, I wouldn't be surprised if that's exactly what happens. What this means for us as fans is simple. Don't fall in love with the idea of seeing BOUTTE in Burgundy and gold just yet. Follow it, enjoy the rumor, debate it in the comments, but understand that front office reality and fan base fantasy are right now living on two completely different planets. And honestly, that gap between what we want and what Peters is willing to pay is the real story behind this story. Okay, bro, breathe with me for a second because what's coming next has me genuinely more excited than the trade rumor, and it's about something that's actually confirmed. Let's talk health, scheme, and this team's entire identity heading into 2026 because these three pieces of information are more connected than they look on the surface. Let's start with Trey Amos because it's the news that gave me the most relief this week. Amos fractured his fibula in week 10 last year, trying to tackle Jahmyr Gibbs against Detroit, and that injury cut short a rookie season that was trending solid. 511 defensive snaps, 8 starts, 32 tackles, and 6 pass breakups before the injury. That's a pace that projected over a full season would have been one of the best cornerback debuts in the league. The problem is Amos couldn't even participate in this year's OTAs. He was still rehabbing in May and June, showing up to the field in a baseball cap instead of a helmet, while new defensive coordinator Durante Jones installed a completely new scheme without him. That's a real risk, bro, because losing mental reps during a new scheme install is just as serious as losing physical reps. But here's the good news landing right before camp. Amos is healthy. And on the most recent depth chart, Amos is already locked in as CB1, ahead of Mike Sainristil, Amek Robertson, Quan Martin, and Will Harris. PFF analysts give him the highest projection rating in the entire cornerback room of 55.8, which doesn't sound flashy in a vacuum, but is the highest ceiling in that room by any metric you use. Why does this matter so much? Because last year, Washington allowed 451 points, one of the worst marks in the entire league. That's not a one-player problem, it's a structural problem, but Amos is the piece that, if he hits his ceiling, solves the biggest one of all, covering #1 receivers in man coverage. Nobody else on this roster has that long corner profile with the reach to fight for the ball against elite receivers. If Amos breaks out in year 2, the rest of the secondary's job gets exponentially easier because Durante Jones can stop hiding Amos and start designing blitzes and coverage disguises around him instead of around his weaknesses. And this ties directly into the second part of this story, the overall state of the roster heading into this season beyond Jaden Daniels. Mike Sainristil enters year 3, and a recent Hogs Haven community survey found a wide majority of fans believe Sainristil is going to take a leap in 2026, mostly because of the defensive philosophy change. Jones's new scheme is built for Sainristil to play fast, trigger downhill on underneath routes, and use his read and react instincts in zone coverage, which are exactly the tools he had at Michigan before entering the league. After a 2025 season where he allowed too much yardage and coverage for anyone's liking, this scheme change fits him like a glove. On the other side of the ball, Treylon Burks remains the offense's most interesting wild card. He's a former first-round pick out of Tennessee who never quite broke out because of injuries, but in recent practices under new offensive coordinator David Blau, he's still making plays. The question with Burks has always been health, not talent. If he stays on the field, he solves a real problem in the receiver room, and Blau, who was Washington's assistant quarterbacks coach the last 2 years and is now the full-time offensive coordinator, is installing a scheme that looks more like what Ben Johnson ran in Detroit and now runs in Chicago. The idea behind that is simple and honestly smart. Reduce the number of hero plays Jaden Daniels had to invent in 2024, so the scheme does more of the heavy lifting and the quarterback doesn't have to carry everything on his shoulders every Sunday. My personal read on this whole package of news is this: 2026 is going to be defined not by whether Daniels is good, because we already know he is, but by whether the rest of the roster stops depending on him to solve every problem individually. Amos healthy takes pressure off the defense. Sainristil in year 3 takes pressure off Jones's scheme. Burks healthy and Blau with a more structured system takes direct pressure off Daniels. If these three pieces fall into place at the same time, this team stops being the Jaden Daniels team and becomes a complete team, which is exactly what it takes to sustain a long playoff run. Fam, tell me in the comments, which of these three do you trust the least? AMOS, Saint Ristil, or Burks? Because for me, there's one that worries me more than the other two, and I'll tell you in a second. But first, there's a draft story I need y'all to understand, because it explains how Adam Peters thinks when nobody's watching. And to close things out, something a little lighter, but that I find fascinating from a how does this front office operate standpoint. In this year's draft, Washington used its final selection in the 7th round on Athan Kaliakmanis, quarterback out of Rutgers. When the pick came out, several analysts slapped a C- grade on Adam Peters, basically saying it was a wasted pick at a position with no apparent need. And on the surface, I get the argument. Marcus Mariota returns for a 3rd straight season as Daniels' backup, and he's widely considered one of the best QB2s in the league. But here's the detail those analysts missed. Mariota turns 33 in October, and in 2024, he did have a solid stretch filling in for an injured Daniels, including that 40-7 win over Carolina and the game-sealing throw to McLaurin that locked up the 6th playoff seed against the Cowboys. The problem showed up in 2025. That's when he had to start 8 full games, finished with a 2-6 record as a starter, and had questionable decision-making in the London game against Miami. Washington already sent Sam Hartman a clear signal that he wasn't the future QB3 when they went with Josh Johnson at the end of last season. So there is a real need here. It's just a 2027 need, not a this year need. Why Kaliakmanis and not Garrett Nussmeier or Haynes King, who were both available in that same stretch of the draft? Kaliakmanis doesn't have King's mobility or Nussmeier's arm, and his accuracy under pressure is still a work in progress. But what he does have is real, measurable progression. His completion percentage jumped from 53.9% in 2024 to 62.2% in 2025 after transferring from Minnesota to Rutgers with 20 touchdowns against only 7 interceptions, and his PFSN impact score hit a career high of 82.2 in his final college season. That's not a stagnant player. That's a player on an upward curve right before entering the league, which is exactly the kind of bet that makes sense in the 7th round. And there's something else that stands out to me. Kaliakmanis visited 6 different teams in the final 8 days before the draft, and Washington decided not to risk losing him in the scramble for undrafted free agents. They brought him in for a top 30 visit, and according to reports, that's where he won over the staff with his football IQ, his ability to work through full field progressions, and the fact that he calls his own pass protections at the line, something not every college quarterback can do. He was literally one of 3 consensus picks in Washington's draft room that day. My opinion on this is simple. This isn't a pick for 2026. It's a pick for 2027 and 2028 for whenever the team has to start thinking about life after Mariota as the backup. Adam Peters doesn't spend draft capital just to spend it, and even though this specific selection isn't going to move the needle for the team this season, it's exactly the kind of quiet, long-term move that separates a front office thinking in years, not months, from one that just puts out fires. I could be wrong about Kaliakmanis' ceiling. Honestly, nobody knows yet, but I'm not wrong about the logic behind the pick. And there you have it, fam. 3 stories that looked at together tell me this front office knows exactly what it's doing, even when the fan base doesn't get it in the moment. BOUTTE probably stays in New England, and that's fine, because Peters isn't going to overpay for a complimentary piece. AMOS comes back healthy right in time to be the piece that changes this entire defense. And Kaliakmanis is the quiet move nobody's going to remember until it becomes relevant a couple years from now. This franchise has been building with patience since Peters walked in, and honestly, keep it a buck. It's refreshing to watch a GM who doesn't panic every time Twitter heats up over a rumor. Training camp is right around the corner, and with Daniels healthy, AMOS healthy, and a new scheme on both sides of the ball, I've got a feeling 2026 is going to look different from anything we've seen before in this uniform. If this video gave you something, hit that like, subscribe, and tell me down below, would you make the BOUTTE trade at a 3rd round pick price, or would you stick with what you've already got at home? I want to read every single answer. See y'all in the next one. Raise hail, always.